Meanwhile, further sanctions against Russia were announced by Japan on Monday, and the UK is due to announce more measures later on Tuesday. Hundreds of international companies have so far suspended their operations or pulled out of Russia. Well, to discuss this and more, we're joined now for Perspective by Sergei Guriev, Professor of Economics at Sciences Po here in Paris. Sergei, we had a stark warning there from the UN. How is the world going to cope with the projected disruptions of supply chains? They're already under pressure since COVID and even before that.
Thanks. It is indeed a huge shock for the global economy. Right now, most of the discussion is focused on the impact on Russia, on Ukraine, and on the developed world. When we talk about oil embargo, for example, or gas embargo in Europe, economists are trying to estimate the shock on Germany or other economies dependent on Russian energy. However, the shock for developing economies will be much bigger because these economies don't have fiscal capacity to support their vulnerable households, to support their industries. And this spike in oil prices, which many of developing economies import, and spike in grain prices, the shortages of grain, will actually hit poor economies much harder. And in that sense, the global community should prepare itself for rolling out additional support to those vulnerable, poor and middle-income economies.
And in terms of what's happening inside Russia, how can the country continue to operate given the kind of sanctions that are being imposed on them? We're going to have disruptions to shipping companies that are operating in and out of Russia. People there can't even charge their iPhones if they have an Apple device. So tell us a little bit about how the economy there can continue to sustain itself.
The disruptions are everywhere, including, for example, air transportation. Russians cannot fly pretty much anywhere because airspace, for example, in Europe and US is closed. On top of that, majority of Russian fleet are Boeings and Airbuses, which are no longer being serviced, and their flight certificates are actually revoked. So if Russians care about air safety, they shouldn't fly even within Russia. But one thing which should not be forgotten is at this level of oil prices, Russian budget, as long as it gets paid for oil deliveries, which is disrupted for the moment because of the transportation issues you mentioned and overall unwillingness of private companies to buy Russian oil. But if these disruptions are overcome, then Russia will be actually not in a bad situation, because with this high oil price, Russian budget will be in surplus, Russian balance of payments will be in surplus, and private sector economists actually predict that ruble will appreciate. That is still, that doesn't mean that Russians will do better. Russians will experience the most important shock to their incomes in 30 years. So in many ways, Russian economy is back to pre-transition times, since many foreign companies have exited. One of symbolic exit is actually McDonald's, which came to Russia in late 1980s. And in that sense, situation is very dire.
And in terms of the financial reserves that Russia has built up, we were told before the invasion that this was a massive amount. Is that going to be enough to sustain the economy, in your view, and for how long?
So the reserves have been frozen. Russian government doesn't disclose the exact composition of the reserves, but mentions that about half of them has been frozen directly because it's half of the reserves are stored in dollars, euros, pounds, yen, and Swiss franc. However, the other half, the yuan and gold, will also be very hard to use. So in that sense, the stock of Russian resources is out of the game. However, as I mentioned, the flow, if Russia overcomes this disruption with the oil revenues coming in, the flow will be sufficient to sustain Putin's war and Putin's repression and propaganda machine, because Putin fights this war not just in Ukraine, but also domestically, where he pays the policemen to beat up the protesters and paid propagandists to brainwash the population. And for that, he needs money. And this money right now is coming to Russia in great amounts because Putin continues to export oil and gas, and Europe continues to pay him hundreds of millions of dollars a day.
Now, hundreds of international brands have announced that they're suspending their operations in Russia, or they're pulling out of the country. You mentioned a couple of them earlier, Coca-Cola and McDonald's. What's at stake for these firms? Perhaps not as much if they had been leaving China, for example. What kind of impact is this going to have on those companies?
Well, China's been left by fewer companies, to put it mildly. Russia has seen the mass exodus of global brands and international companies. Russian economy is not a huge part of the global economy. Before the war, it was already 1.7% of global GDP. Now it will be closer to 1% in dollar terms, because Russian ruble lost about 40% of its value. So global companies will survive this issue. I think they're exiting exactly because they think that their global reputation is much more important than the money they can make in Russia. And also, with the ruble in a free fall, Russian economy will not be able to provide them with great profits anyway. So these companies will lose, but for them, the balance is still worth it, because the exit from Russia helps them save their international reputation.
What, on the other hand, then, what about the companies like Danone here in France who are staying in Russia? They say that they have a duty to their customers, to producers there, to farmers. What's the risk of further reputational damage for the firms that are staying in Russia?
Well, there are definitely firms that need to stay in Russia to provide a livelihood to Russians, such as pharmaceutical products. If you're a doctor, you treat your patient even if the patient is a criminal, right? And this is, I think, the rationale for pharmaceutical companies to keep providing medicines to Russians. These medicines are very expensive by now, but still, these crucial imports are continuing. As for Danone's decision, I don't see the big difference between Danone and, say, McDonald's or IKEA, who also have a lot of employees, who also have a lot of clients and customers, and yet those companies have exited. So I'm not sure what the logic of Danone is and how it's different from other international brands that have exited Russia.
And what, Sergei, about the impact on the Ukrainian economy? It's obviously far too early to tell what that's going to be, but the IMF announced €1 billion in additional funding last week. What do you see happening there?
Well, Ukrainian economy is in a dire situation. Russian military have bombed civilian infrastructure, and indeed Ukraine will need a huge reconstruction package. Ukraine will get something like a Marshall Plan for post-war Europe once this war is over, and that could be funded by IMF and the World Bank and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. But it may also be funded actually through settlement in international courts, where international courts will sue Russia. Ukraine will sue Russia in international courts, and will actually get some of those frozen reserves to pay for reconstruction of Ukraine. This is completely plausible, and I think while the human tragedy which is happening on the ground right now is enormous, I think after the war, Ukraine will be rebuilt. But at the moment, we need to stop this war at any cost. And I think economists also have part, and I think what's happening on the ground right now is beyond belief.
Finally, Sergei, we've heard an awful lot about energy prices over the past 2 to 3 weeks. The EU is trying to ease the pain there. France, for example, appears to be more protected than some of its European neighbours. What do you think can be done to ease the pressure across the board?
Well, France indeed relies more on nuclear energy than on imported Russian gas. If we talk about the global energy market, US is already negotiating with Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Emirates to increase supplies. That is the most important action. Increasing supply right now will ease the pressure on oil prices, because in one way or another, Russian oil is not coming into the market, whether because of oil embargo by the US and de facto oil embargo by private companies in the West, which refuse to buy Russian oil. So increasing supply is key, and I'm very happy to see that US government is trying to negotiate such increases with its allies.
Sergei Guriev, Professor of Economics at Sciences Po here in Paris. Thank you so much for that very comprehensive analysis. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.